Okay, I want to take a second and expand on my last video where I was talking about how self-defense is not violence, especially as somebody who is really committed to nonviolent discipline. I think it's important that we understand what violence is and isn't. Also going to continue to talk up this book, Revolutionary Nonviolence, by Reverend James M. Lawson Jr., who was a prominent figure in the United States civil rights movement. He has an entire section, I read part of it out on my YouTube the other day, about what he considers violence. And it's important to understand the way that there are societal structural forms of violence like racism and misogyny, and how nonviolence as a philosophy seeks to dismantle those violent systems of oppression. But for the purpose of this video, I'd like to point y'all to Common Sense Ethics. They have a really good piece called What Everyone Needs to Know About Violence and Self-Defense. It's really long, but it is absolutely worth reading the entire thing. It starts off with a quote from Gandhi: "Self-defense is the only honorable course where there is unreadiness for self-immolation." I'm just going to read you some portions and, as always, insert some commentary. In my experience, many people do not have a well thought out position regarding interpersonal violence and self-defense. The prevalent attitude seems to vary between two extremes: a naive type of pacifism on one hand, or a let's get 'em type of aggression on the other. Both positions are unreasonable in different ways. Sounds a lot like the polarization of American politics, that kind of really strong binary thinking that is so prevalent in social media spaces, but in the culture in general. It's like a moderate, well-informed, nuanced position is preferable to an extreme polarized one. The author goes on to say the need for self-defense will persist until everyone in the world is non-aggressive. Therefore, the most pragmatic and ethical position is one of conscious non-initiation of violence, which at the same time does not preclude forceful self-defense if necessary. I agree with the author here. I do think that too many Americans believe that any kind of physical altercation is obligatorily defined as violence, and I don't think that's true. The author says that most people tend to think of violence as physical force used to inflict injury or damage, but that is not the same as using physical force to defend yourself against injury or damage. I do appreciate that the author explains the difference between self-defense and revenge, because self-defense is responding to an immediate threat against you or those around you that you are protecting, but revenge is an entirely different beast. I think too many people conflate nonviolence with pacifism. She discusses how pacifism is a refusal to engage in any form of physical altercation, often including self-defense. Think of pacifists as being conscientious objectors who refuse to fight even in defense of their country. This is different than, for example, folks who ascribe to non-aggression. Non-aggression says, obviously, you're not going to be the aggressor. But while it may be unethical to initiate acts of violence, it is acceptable to use protective force in cases of self-defense. While people who employ an overarching strategy of nonviolence, when they are crafting strategic acts of nonviolence, could potentially be pacifists, or could embrace the principle of non-aggression, it doesn't mean that nonviolence has to be either of those things, right? These things are not synonymous, and I think it's important to understand that nonviolence is a tactical choice, far more than anything else. Some people, I have this series on nonviolent resistance, you can go watch on my YouTube, but some people come to nonviolence because it is a moral choice, it's an ethical choice. Some people come to it because they believe it is strategic, they believe it is more effective. And then, of course, in a departure from all three of those others, we have the pro-aggression position, which I think is what a lot of people fantasize about when they think about resisting an oppressive regime. The pro-aggression position says that it's okay to initiate violence out of a self-protective instinct. I also agree with the author that vengeance falls under this pro-aggression strategy as well, right? The Bible says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, then you become punitive. Everything becomes about retribution. Again, going back to strategic nonviolence is strategic. Aggression like this can be unstrategic. It can sabotage your own cause and create escalating cycles of violence and retribution. And, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. The author has this large section on what she defines as naive pacifism, and I find some of the points that she makes really interesting here. She says that naive pacifists often choose to leave their self-defense needs to the state, right? It reminds me of how people don't want to raise and butcher their own animals, but they're happy to buy hamburger at the grocery store. They want to leave that kind of physical act to somebody else and not get their hands dirty and not engage in upsetting actions like self-defense, because self-defense does come with an impact to your psyche. It comes with an impact to your conscience. I don't think that there are decent human beings who can engage in acts of self-defense and not struggle with what happens, right? Not struggle with the reality of what they had to engage in afterward. Naive pacifists push that burden off onto somebody else. They usually assume that it's the police who are going to protect them and do the defending. Some naive pacifists routinely conflate the mere act of owning one of these with violence or violent intent. This shows a serious lack of critical thinking. There is a huge causal leap from the neutral act of simply owning a firearm to the act of using it for self-defense purposes, to the act of using it to initiate aggressive violence. These are three distinct things, not one and the same, which is why I said when you see the Black Panthers out on the streets of Philly or Minnesota or what have you, and they are simply expressing their 2A rights by open carrying, that's not an act of violence. The author then gets into a conversation about whether weapons in general help even the playing field for those who are weaker, right? And therefore are justified as a tool for defense. She has a whole big section on Buddhism and self-defense, and I'll skip all of that and jump down to where she talks about Thoreau, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King and their positions on self-defense. These are three men who all advocated for nonviolence, but none of them opposed self-defense. Not only did Thoreau argue for the proper use of forcible resistance in a debate in 1841, but he famously said, "Let not our peace be proclaimed by the rust on our swords or our inability to draw them from their scabbards, but let her at least have so much work on her hands as to keep those swords bright and sharp." Gandhi's position is more complex. He has moments where he admits the necessity of self-defense. He unfortunately uses the word violence in the broad sense, meaning any physical altercation, though. While he intended non-resistance to violence as a tool for political protest against colonial imperialists in India, he may not have intended the same paradigm to guide your average individual in self-defense situations. He did argue that self-defense or defense of the defenseless is an act of bravery far better than cowardly submission. I do think it's important to understand that effective nonviolence is not submission. It is not submission. It is a resistance against the regime. Rolling over and obeying, that is not nonviolence. That is deciding to obey a violent regime and therefore becoming complicit in that violence. MLK was influenced by Gandhi's application of nonviolent resistance as a tool for political change, but in his own personal life, MLK had firearms in his home. He famously applied for a concealed carry permit, and Georgia denied him that because racism. The author says, "Such is the problem with having to ask an unjust government for permission to exercise a civil right as legitimate armed self-defense." There are tactical choices that involve letting law enforcement brutalize you. The state will be violent. They are inherently violent. Many times when you are engaged in acts of nonviolent discipline, you are choosing to put yourself in a position where you know you are going to be injured. This is why I think it's so important for all of us to become incredibly well-versed in what nonviolent discipline is, how these are tactical choices that we are making to advance our cause, how we employ them in a strategic way that helps us accomplish the goal of defending our liberty, building our movement, getting more people on our side, turning public opinion against the regime, and stopping the fascists. Nonviolence is a tool that you wield. I wish I could get more people to understand. These are tactical choices. These are deliberate strategies that we are employing because they benefit the cause. When we operate with strategic nonviolence, we are operating from a position of strength. And you can be strategically nonviolent and also be somebody who believes in conscious non-initiation, which says that you have a right to defend yourself. If someone initiates violence against you, you have a right to defend yourself, and that choice is not a choice to embrace violence. It is an entirely separate action than a deliberate choice to engage in nonviolence. Protecting yourself or your loved ones with force is not a moral failing. But none of these choices are things that we do impulsively. These are things that we game out, we strategize for, and we make conscious choices. So what do you think? What's your position on self-defense and how that folds in to nonviolence as a strategy? How are those strategies that we can use together to help us as we resist the brutality and the tyranny of the Trump regime?